What's up, people? We're back at it again with another 1-bar build. This week we're going to play around with a stamina dragon knight using a two-handed weapon and of course an Oakensoul ring. Last week we applied this general setup to a sorcerer with a handful of alternative skills and gear sets, so we'll be doing the same thing today on a dragon knight. I'll mention it at the top, this build is meant to be used primarily as a solo setup for content like arenas, world bosses, public dungeons, and that kind of thing. It'll still work fine in 4-player content, particularly the normal mode stuff, since we're kind of going for a survivable type of character that can chip away at the enemy. Something of a hybrid character that can heal themselves, deal decent damage, and survive groups of enemies. When it's all said and done, you don't have to only do solo content, and you should definitely experiment with whatever types of things you want to do, and make changes to the build based on your own personal preferences. Alright, so first of all, we'll want to play as an orc, an imperial, a red guard, a nord, a dark elf, a wood elf, or a Khajiit. The other magicka and healing races probably wouldn't be an optimal choice, but it's up to you how you want to play. So don't worry too much if your Dragon Knight character happens to be on a different race, because it'll still work, maybe just a little less than optimally. We're going to place all of our attribute points into stamina, and we're going to take the thief as our Mundus stone. The lover here would work alternatively if you want more penetration, but we want critical, so we're going with the thief. Our food will ideally be takeaway broth or smoked bear haunch, but as always, if you're lacking the funds for these higher tier foods, you can always get away with using bewitched sugar skulls as a tri-stat food or the crown food if you're just running super easy content and don't need to worry too much about sustain. We can use tri-restoration potions as our slotted healing item, so don't worry about using anything expensive. Moving on to our gear. The two sets that we'll be using are going to be Sergeant's Mail along with Order's Wrath. Sergeant's Mail is a heavy weighted set that can be obtained in the Wayrest Sewers and Wayrest Sewers 2 dungeons. This set gives us some max health and health recovery, a damage buff, and gives us stacks of Sergeant's Focus when we complete heavy attacks that continuously buffs up our heavy attack damage. So we'll be slotting Sergeant as a chest piece so we get some extra armor, a maul for some extra penetration along with either a poison or a flame glyph, and then as a ring and a necklace, both in Bloodthirsty with weapon damage enchantments. Our other set, Order's Wrath, is being used to maximize our critical chance while giving us another buff to our weapon damage. This one can be crafted in the high isle zone in any weight, but we'll want to use medium here. If you don't have access to this DLC, you can always ask someone else to craft it for you or just buy the pieces you need. We're going to be equipping Order's Wrath on our belt, our shoulders, arms, legs, and feet. We are going to want all of our armor pieces, including the previous Sergeant's piece, to be Divines with max stamina glyphs. We're also going to wear light Slimecross guise as a helmet with the same trait and glyph. We're using light for this piece to take advantage of the Undaunted Metal passive, which gives us a little stat boost. A few alternative sets that would work nicely here would start with Noble Duelist. You can loot this set from the Blessed Crucible dungeon, but it's a light set, so keep that in mind when it comes to swapping armor pieces around. This one gives us a damage buff, adds to our stamina recovery, and when we do light or heavy attacks, we get a buff to them that basically stays active all the time. As I mentioned in a previous video, this would work well for a more hands-off approach, though you'll be missing out on a little bit of the buff that Sergeant's Mail provides, and you'll miss out on some of the armor as well, but if that trade-off sounds worth it to you, then I would say give it a try. Another set worth looking into for this setup would be the craftable Gold Coast set Kvatch Gladiator. This one gives us critical chance, a damage buff, and gives us a big boost to our damage when we're attacking targets that are under 25% health. Grave Inevitability is another set that could work here. This one can be looted in the Graven Deep dungeon from the Lost Depths DLC and gives us some critical chance, some weapon damage, and when we deal damage with light or heavy attacks, we stack up Remorseless, which at 5 stacks gives us Major Force, which increases our critical damage by 20%. And then also grants us with an aura that gives our allies minor force. A fire maximalist may want to look into Way of Fire from the Craglorn Overland. This one gives us some weapon damage, adds to our stamina pool, gives us some critical chance, and when we deal damage with a weapon, we deal additional flame damage every 2 seconds. The newer set, Runecarver's Blaze, has the same sort of thing going on, though I would probably use Way of Fire in place of it if I was going for a Beavis Pyromaniac roleplay setup.
Fire.
And one final set that works very well in the context of solo builds is always Hexo's Ward. This one can be looted from the Deadlands Overland or purchased from a guild trader. It grants some critical chance and weapon damage while granting us a damage shield when we deal critical damage. Sorry for the mouthful on alternative sets, but I feel that one of the most interesting parts of this game is the sheer amount of options that we have when it comes to gear. I like to offer a couple alternatives to keep it fresh, and the way that I play may not be the same as the way you play, so if you want to test something else out in place of any of the gear that I'm using, or the extra ones that I suggested, there are likely another dozen sets that would work just fine, so don't be afraid to try new things out and figure out what makes the game actually fun for you. And as always, if your gear pieces aren't all upgraded fully to gold, you can still play the game and complete most things. Just upgrade your stuff as you can afford to do so, and don't overthink it or think that you have to wait to play until your stuff is all perfect. Moving over to the champion point section, we're going to slot whatever in the green section. I like mount speed, so I like to use Gifted Rider, Steed's Blessing, War Mount, and Rationer. Over in the blue section, we'll want to slot Deadly Aim, Fighting Finesse, Master at Arms, and Reaving Blows. If you don't need Reaving Blows for the extra healing, you can always put Weapons Expert here to buff up your heavy attacks, or maybe Wrathful Strikes or something like that. In the red section, we'll be slotting Boundless Vitality, Strategic Reserve, Bloody Renewal, and Bastion. You could swap Rejuvenation out in place of Bastion for a little buff to your recovery, Celerity for a movement speed buff, or maybe Fortified for some extra armor. I've gone with Bastion here to maximize the effectiveness of our damage shields, which we'll be getting from multiple sources, or depending on your setup, potentially many sources. For our passive skills, we'll want to get all of the armor passives since we're using all 3 weights. We're also going to want to get Iron Skin and Scaled Armor from the Draconic Power skill line, everything from Ardent Flame and Earthen Heart. Be sure to get your Undaunted passives, Racial passives, anything from Alliance War and Craft that you like to use, and then everything from Two-Handed. The way that our heavy attacks work with this setup is by taking the Forceful passive, which copies the damage we do with a fully charged heavy attack from the target enemy onto 3 other nearby enemies, in basically the same way that a Lightning Staff heavy attack build works. Moving on to our skill bar, we're going to firstly include Flames of Oblivion. This is a set it and forget it type of skill that passively shoots out fireballs to 3 enemies. We're also going to slot Stampede from the Two-Handed skill line. This one works as a mobility tool to launch us at an enemy from a distance while also dealing a guaranteed critical upon landing, while also applying a damage over time effect on the ground where we land. Our third skill will be Carve. We use this skill to swing our maul in front of us, and it can be stacked on bigger enemies up to 3 times, causing the bleed damage over time to extend to a possible 32-second maximum, which is great for tougher enemies and can also just be spammed on trash mobs if you're feeling frisky. Using this skill also grants us a damage shield, which is a nice added bonus that adds on to our survivability and can be reprocced. In order for us to apply Major Breach, we're going to be using Noxious Breath. This doubles as a damage over time ability in the form of poison damage. Alternatively, we could slot Razor Caltrops here if we wanted to apply Breach from a greater distance, while also slowing our enemies. Each skill has their pros and cons, so this is entirely up to you and your personal preferences. And then our last skill is going to be Hardened Armor. This one will last for 20 seconds, letting us play a bit more passively. We gain another damage shield and also send back some damage that comes to us in melee range as flame damage. Our ultimate is going to be Ferocious Leap. This can get us out of tough situations when we find ourselves overrun with enemies, knocking them back and stunning them, and it also grants us a nice big damage shield once we cast it so we can get out of a bad situation and kind of get our bearings back. It's also cheap to use in terms of ultimate relative to the alternatives like Standard of Might or Corrosive Armor. In any case, any of the Dragon Knight ultimates would work here, and you'll find that some work better than others depending on the actual situation that you're in. Flawless Dawnbreaker would work here too if you like that skill. So some alternative skills, if you'd prefer a single target attack in place of one of these skills, I would suggest Burning Embers from the Ardent Flame skill line. This provides us with a powerful damage over time ability that also heals us back, increasing our survivability a bit more. If you prefer to do a little more damage without those heals, you could always use the other morph, Venomous Claw, instead. Some other useful skills to keep in mind would be Cauterize, Echoing or Resolving Vigor, Green Dragon Blood, or Coagulating Blood, since we aren't using any actual healing skills. One of the heals could easily replace Stampede, or Flames of Oblivion, or maybe even Hardened Armor. So if there's a DPS check mechanic or something like that, you can always keep the Lava Whip in mind too. Remember, it's all about how you personally like to play, and certain content might call for different skills. Our skill bar here is meant to work as a general template that will work for most situations, but you may end up needing some heals, a different morph, depending on what you're doing. And if you're a more sweaty type, you can always use the dressing room add-on to make different skill bars for different situations, like maybe one for fighting trash mobs, one for super stationary bosses, one for specific arenas or trials or whatever. Our rotation is going to be pretty straightforward here, much like with the sorcerer version of this build. So we're going to want to pre-buff with hardened armor and flames of oblivion, so we're prepared with a damage shield, and we're sending out fireballs along with returning flame damage with our armor. Launch into your enemy with stampede if you've slotted it, dealing a critical and sundering the ground underneath. Be sure to apply major breach with noxious breath and carve any groups of trash mobs to get your damage shield, while being sure to remember that you can stack it 3 times on tougher enemies or spam it on groups of trash mobs. And then just put the beat down on everyone with heavy attacks before you repeat the cycle when your timers run down. As long as you're actively dealing direct damage, you'll be consistently healing at all times from the Reaving Blows champion ability, and you'll have damage shields that can be reprocced just by using carve on an enemy or recasting hardened armor when you need it. Use your ultimate when you're in a pickle to shake enemies off and get another damage shield, and if you're using green dragon blood or a healing skill, be sure to use that in combination with your potions. Aside from your potions and Reaving Blows, we're kind of replacing healing with just having damage shields instead. So for most content this works great, but like I mentioned before, you might actually want to swap in a heal for certain content, like maybe the final boss in Veteran Hollows or something like that. Here's some footage from some content I ran earlier so you can get an idea of what it looks like out in the world. You should have no problem taking down world bosses, any overland content, and some of the veteran content in game too. And if you're looking for a group of like-minded 1-bar homies in-game and you're on the PC NA server, you can look up our tiny guild 1-bar bros in the guild finder or send me a message in-game for an invite at Dumpster. Alright, thanks for watching as always, until next time.